This is the Lifestyle Builders Podcast, Show 83. 6 Lessons of Love and Business from 22 Plus Couples, Part 2. Hi, Ariana here with a quick PSA about why this topic is so important to us. Tom and I know how challenging it can be to start and run a business, to take care of your loved ones, and on top of it all, to keep a healthy relationship with your spouse. It isn't easy, and that is why we created our Lifestyle Builders Mentorship Program. As a special offer during this very special Couples and Entrepreneurship Month, we'd like to invite you to get started with your first month of Lifestyle Builders for only $1. So if you, and your spouse is welcome too, need more strategy, support, and guidance in your business and life, plus people who truly care about you and will keep you accountable, sign up now at tomandariana.com/LBcouples with the code LBcouples. All right, we're back. We've got 3 more lessons or themes that kind of came out from our couple series last month.
Well, and I'll tell you, I'm so glad we're doing this because it's one thing to hear something once, but then to go back and kind of evaluate it afterwards, I think gives you a deeper understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I was in grad school, one of my favorite classes was we had I think like 18 different like CEOs come in from all these different size organizations. And the classes were about 3 hours. So we would take the first 90 minutes and the CEO would kind of talk about their journey, their lessons in leadership, how they got to where they were at. And then we would basically kick them out. And the second 90 minutes, we would talk about them. And I say that because we were analyzing them kind of like we're doing with this. Like, what are the common themes that all these leaders have? Like, what is it that makes them successful versus, what did they do that maybe caused them some issues? And it was through that, and why that was probably my most impactful course was it was not just something you read in a book, right? It was real world examples of real people. And then seeing when you talk to all these very successful people, what those common themes were that you can then take and apply to your life. And I think that's exactly what not only this series did, but as we're going back and kind of talking through the episodes, what you guys as listeners can then take from this and apply to your lives.
Yeah. I think that's huge. And it's been really fun to go back and just kind of think through all of the people that we talked to and all of the different areas that we covered and the different challenges that we covered, and kind of coming out of it with these themes was really interesting for me because it was kind of almost like, oh, I forgot what we talked about, and then I went back and I was thinking through everyone and it's like, oh yeah, we talked about that with them too. And we talked about that with them too. So it almost was like I got refreshed with all of these shows and talking to all these different couples about their story.
Yeah. Well, I remember when I was taking that class, like I would talk to different people and we would each kind of have our favorites. Like this was the leader, the executive that I aligned with. And I think with this series, the listeners, like you guys are probably going to have the same type of thing, right? Like there's probably one couple or maybe a set of couples where it's like, these guys are just like us, or I really like what they had to say. And I'm going to take that and apply it to my life. So what we, I think, ended up with here was pretty amazing with just the variety of different couples we had. We had couples that were married, couples that weren't married. We had couples that worked together in business, couple that had different businesses, couples where one spouse was the entrepreneur and one wasn't. We had couples with kids, couples that didn't have kids, couples that have been together for 50 years, couples that were just getting together.
Couples that had grandkids.
Yeah, so there's something for everyone here, which I really loved about, this series.
Yeah. All right. So all that being said, we are going to continue on with the last 3 themes from this series as a whole. The first one is how not to approach your spouse.
Why do you look at me when you say that?
This theme was one of the ones where it was very apparent in the couples where one spouse was the entrepreneur and one spouse wasn't. And in every single case, there was an example of, I told so-and-so about my business idea and she shot me down or something. And so this is obviously something that a lot of people go through because you went through it as well.
Mhm.
And if we can even just help one person approach their spouse more prepared or with a thought out plan, then it has all
Yep.
been worth it.
Absolutely.
All right. So the first couple, which was not, well, they weren't the first couple, but one of the couples, their story was hilarious. This was PT and Teresa Taylor. And so she's not the entrepreneur and PT is. He's a financial blogger.
Yep.
He runs FinCon, the big conference for people in the financial space, entrepreneurs in the financial space.
That we're actually about to
about to go to. And it was hilarious. Teresa told us the story of like when he first pitched the idea of leaving his job and doing the entrepreneurship full time was on date night.
That's not what you're supposed to do?
Nope. So, as you can imagine, Teresa did not respond to that. So as he was expecting. And, they kind of had the conversation about, I understand this is something important to you, but, this wasn't the time and place to bring up the idea. And she said it's not the only time that has happened because he also came up with the idea for FinCon. Like one night when they were going to bed and kind of like relaxing, just chatting with each other. And all of a sudden he rolled over and was like, I'm going to start a financial bloggers conference. And she was like, what?
Well, and this actually goes back to our first point from the first episode where we recap this, which was you can find it at tomandariana.com/82. But it was really about getting aligned because oftentimes what I find is that, and I think we heard in these episodes, when you approach your spouse about this business idea you have, but you haven't first got aligned on what you want out of life, in your mind, it all logically makes sense as the entrepreneur. But if your spouse isn't aligned with you on where you want to go, when you present it to them, they're like, this is out of left field. Like, what are you even talking about? So I think like the key thing here, like in that scenario was, had they been aligned first, then bringing up this conversation, not on date night, probably would have worked out a little bit better.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can find PT and Teresa's episode was number 75. So that was, it was a really fun episode.
Ariana has all these numbers memorized.
I do.
Like she was going through them and like I was quizzing her and she's just throwing out episode numbers. I'm like, how do you know that?
All of you guests that were on our show, I loved you so much. I memorized all of your show numbers.
Another couple was Andy and Nicole, and they were episode 70. But this, and I think this happens for everybody that goes through this. So Andy basically had listened to Dave Ramsey, and I've seen this time and time again. When somebody listens to Dave and Dave gets you all inspired about like paying off your debt and living, financially free. And so he got the idea, like ran home and just said, we're going to like pay off all our debt and blah, blah, blah. And Nicole's like, what are you even talking about? So I've seen it not only with Dave Ramsey, but I think anytime an entrepreneur gets an idea, we get inspired and we just want to share it. We're like, look, this is what we're going to do and it's going to be amazing. And then the spouse's response is totally like, what?
Well, and I think the key, which we talked about with Andy and Nicole, is as the entrepreneur, you have to remember that you have taken a certain journey to get to where you are in your thought process. You've seen the opportunity. You've started taking some action. You've heard somebody that has inspired you to go out and do all these things. Your spouse has absolutely no clue what any of that is. They haven't taken the same journey as you. They haven't had those aha moments that you've had that have gotten you all inspired. So when you go to approach them with this idea, you have to remember all that. Like they literally have no idea what you are talking about, or they don't know why this is even something you're talking about. So you have to approach them keeping that in mind. And I think not having any expectations for how they're going to react, because this is a big one. Like Tom talked about me being actually this was Armando and Christian he talked about Christian being the dream killer because he would come with ideas and he would always shoot him down. I was basically Tom's dream killer. And when you come to somebody with all of that and you have a certain expectation for how you want them to react, when they don't react exactly as you had planned, then it feels like somebody's killing your dreams. as opposed to going into that conversation with no expectations, leaving it open and giving your spouse space to kind of go through the gamut of emotions and thoughts that are kind of running through their heads, then it's less of a, oh, they're killing my dream, than let me help them along the journey and explain to them why I think this is a good idea and what's so important about it.
Well, and I think, the flip side, so for the spouse, if the entrepreneur approaches you, realize that they're excited. They probably want to do this for a bigger purpose and they've gotten inspired. So instead of, just immediately telling them like, no, it's not going to work. No, we're not going to do that. I'd recommend, ask questions, because asking questions is going to do a couple things. It's going to help you get clarity on like, why they came to this and why they think it's important. But it's also going to help the entrepreneur to think through some of the things that maybe they haven't thought about, because, usually we get excited. We just want to go. So you're actually going to play a really good purpose of helping them think through those things, while at the same time not saying no. Because I think one of the worst things for the entrepreneur is when we get excited and we bring up an idea and immediately our spouse just like says no, or that's not going to work. This is the person we love. And it literally is like they're crushing our dreams. So I think it's important on both sides, but realize that both sides kind of have a responsibility and a way that they can approach that situation to have constructive conversation rather than just like shutting it down and not being able to talk through like why it's important and what you'll actually do with it.
Mm-hmm. And this was actually, they talked about this a little bit, was Jason and Audrey in show number 72. Audrey was always very supportive, but she was the one who was willing to ask those questions sometimes because, she kind of watched Jason work through stuff in the beginning and not get a lot of traction. And she said she noticed a huge change when he found Shane and Jocelyn's podcast and listened to it. And all of a sudden it was like the light bulb went off and he figured out what he needed to do. But, I think if she hadn't played that important part of kind of continuing to keep him on his toes and asking him the questions and making sure that he was still showing up for their marriage, it would have been very easy for him to kind of go down the rabbit hole of ideas and get lost in there. And the funny story that they told was there was one night where Jason was going to go back and just record a quick podcast or a quick YouTube video for his channel. And Audrey was waiting because she wanted to go to a movie with him. And she's waiting and she's waiting and she's waiting. And she finally went back after 6 hours. He had been in his back room recording this video. And she goes in and she's like, it's 11 p.m. There are no more movies.
We could have watched 3 movies in the time while I was waiting for you.
And he was just like, I was in the flow and I had to do what I had to do. So it was, that was one of those moments for her where, she talked about not realizing the amount of time and effort that it was going to take for him to get that off the ground. And, obviously they were getting married. This was a big commitment for both of them. And even though she kind of knew that some of that was going to be necessary, she didn't know quite how much. And I think that's just a really good lesson to take away from, this journey is making sure you're continually checking in with your spouse and like, hey, I know I've been working a lot. This has been...
Well, I mean, so a lot of that comes back to expectations. Like that's where so many things get off is when, we have expectations of someone else or of ourselves and we don't share those, so, as when you're having this conversation, part of it is like, well, what are your expectations? So if we're doing this business, how much time do you think it's going to take? How much money do you think it's going to take? What are you expecting of me? And then vice versa. I think part of what, the spouse can play is, holding that entrepreneur accountable. Like, hey, what is it? Like, how much time are we going to give this? And what are we going to do if at that point it doesn't work? Because as an entrepreneur, especially if you're trying to do it yourself, it can take a lot of time to make work as well as mental kind of things you got to figure out. So having that spouse be able to check in and not from a like, haha, I told you it's not going to work, but more of like, hey, it seems like you're kind of struggling here. Like, what can I do to support you? Or what do you need to be able to work through this? I think that means a lot from, whichever role you're playing.
Yeah. And I think to close out this particular theme, we're going to jump back to John and Kate's episode, show 59, because they actually had an interesting dynamic to their relationship where, John had the business before, and then he wanted to invite Kate to come and work in the business with him. And he went about it in maybe not the right way at first. Like they were taking a walk like on the beach, and he just threw it out there like, hey, what if you came and worked with me? And, he talks about like how that was the complete wrong way to approach it. He hadn't taken any thoughts.
Well, and Kate did a great job, and she didn't immediately shut it down. Nope. She started asking questions, so she's like, okay, well, what would that look like? And John's like, I don't know. But here's the thing. By her asking questions, what she did was force John to think about that, and it didn't immediately close the conversation. They could then continue working through that. So like I loved how they approached that, and they approached everything they did like very logically, which was awesome to just kind of see that dynamic back and forth.
Yeah. And I remember one of her things she said was like, my first thought was, how is that going to affect our relationship? And, that was one of the questions she asked John. She asked what her role would be, what it would look like for them to work together. And John had to leave that conversation and like kind of go back and think about all those things. And then he said it was not until the next, I want to say it was like 3 or 6 months later, that he came back with a plan this time and, put it out there to her and said, hey, I think you should come and work with me. It's going to look like this, and we're going to do it this way, and we're going to make sure that it doesn't affect our relationship. And, he kind of had that whole plan laid out. And obviously now, as you can see, they are working together very well.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, I think, about this whole thing is, when you go to get married, there's always, well, not always, but like there's this conversation that a lot of couples have about, do we get a prenup or not? Like we didn't, because we met when we didn't have anything and it wasn't an issue. But I think the cool thing about doing that is it forces you to kind of look ahead in the future and just run through the different scenarios. And I think you can do the same type of thing when you approach your spouse or get approached about a business. You look in the future and run through all the different scenarios. Okay, well, what will this look like and how will this change our lives if it's successful? What will it look like and how will it change our lives if it takes more time or more money than we think? How will that change if it's not successful? But by running through those scenarios, you can really get clear and set expectations, and then being aligned, on how you proceed forward from that.
Yeah. And then we sort of hit on this a couple times already, but the next theme that was hugely apparent,
I think this came
pretty
through
much
like
every show, was defining roles. And when we talk about that, it's not just defining the roles in the business, because obviously not every couple worked together. This was also about defining roles in life, in your marriage, as parents, whatever dynamic you have. And I think the couple that really stood out to me with this one was Carrie and Demir. They were show 62. And
their method for this was awesome.
Yeah. So they did what they called a roles auction. So they literally listed all of the things that they were responsible for, whether it was in their business or in their personal life, and then they auctioned them off. So they said, as you can imagine, like all the favorite things, all the cool things to do went first, because they each picked from one of the sides to pick all those roles. And then it was left with like, here are the things we don't really enjoy, but obviously somebody's got to do them so that things can keep running. And then here are the things that we really, really dislike. And they talked about going through like, is this something that we still have to do, or is this something that we can delegate out to somebody else? Like, can we hire someone to do it so that we don't have to? Because a lot of times I think we all get stuck with roles that we don't necessarily want, but we don't think about, well, how can I get this role off my plate?
Well, and here's why this is so important. Most entrepreneurs, if they start the business and then they pull their spouse in, what ends up happening
you give your spouse all the roles you don't want. You give the spouse
all the things you don't want. So it's like, it's like back in gym class when you were like, doing a kickball team. It's like you took all the all-stars and then you just gave your spouse like everyone that was left over. But that's what we as entrepreneurs do. And I think that was actually shown really well with like Jay and Jessica.
Yep.
Their episode was 63, but this was hilarious, by the way. Jay actually fired Jessica from their business.
So he was working in his real estate business. Oops, I keep hitting the mic. And they talked about like they had somebody that was doing that role and then that person left. So they needed someone to step in and kind of take it over temporarily. Well, Jessica took that role over and it was not temporary. Like she ended up being in that role for almost a year. And what they talked about was like, Jay firing her, they actually got to that point where he had to fire her from that role. And a lot of that was because they hadn't done any kind of roles discussion about like, okay, well, what roles should we each be playing? What roles do we want to be playing? And then what should be played by somebody else? So the role Jessica had shouldn't even have been her role. She talked about it was just really awkward because she was married to Jay. And then because Jay owned the company, like they had other employees, but then that was a really awkward dynamic because Jay was technically her boss in the role.
And
that
she
had.
went from a sales role to like more of a like admin role.
Mm-hmm.
But
it just made things really awkward for them. And then, obviously they have a funny story now, but I'm sure it was not funny when they had to actually go through that. And
well, and I mean, this was exactly like what we went through. So basically, I got so overwhelmed with the businesses because I was also working a job and everything else that you stepped in and basically said, let me help. And you ended up picking all the like balls that I was dropping.
All the admin roles.
And then they ended up staying. And like that was one of the biggest things I think, with us that we learned was, my perspective was, well, Ariana's helping with this, but then we want to get it off her plate. When we look back later on, that was the problem, was that I delegated it to you, but I never helped you delegate it to somebody else. And that's where like that roles auction I think was so cool. And we're actually going to go through and do this with our current stuff and just kind of see what comes out of it. But we have a lot of different roles we play. And I think if we do the roles auction, we're going to even identify a lot more opportunity for us to delegate and maybe even swap some of the roles where the other person would be a better fit for.
Yeah. And I think this was really apparent in Rachel and Paul's episode as well, which was show 64, because they ended up taking a slightly different approach where instead of sharing all things in life and business, they actually sort of split it down the middle. And Rachel was doing a lot of the tasks in the business where Paul was taking care of their home life, because at the time that this was happening, that just was the better fit for them. And, I think that's a conversation that a lot of people have. And Jay and Jessica talked about this a little bit too, where there are different seasons in your business and in your personal life where, things are going to happen. Life is going to happen. And sometimes it's easier for each of you, for like somebody to take on the role of managing the life while the other person takes on the role of managing the business. Now, this is going to be different for every couple, because it's all based on your dynamic and what works for you. But for some of our couples, like that worked out very well because they could each focus on one thing instead of feeling like they had split focus across all of the boards and, marriage and parenting and business. It's like, okay, well, I'm responsible for taking care of the home life right now and supporting my spouse in the business. And the spouse says, okay, I'm responsible for the business and supporting our lifestyle. So I think that roles conversation is very important to have in your home life as well. And then also looking at the line drawn between the life and business. Is everything going to be integrated and kind of in the middle of both of you? Or are you going to kind of split off and take different aspects?
Yeah, well, all of this really comes back to that alignment, because without alignment, it's hard to figure out like what roles even exist and what roles you should play. But I love the fact that you said about the focus, because there's times where like splitting the roles makes a lot of sense, but there's also times where being able to focus helps so much. And especially like, for example, when you have a major event, like when you have kids, that focus is almost required. And that's where, going back to like Armando's analogy with the band, that's going to come to the forefront. And it might be good to have one person just dedicated to that. And then on the flip side, there might be times where like you're starting a business and you just need to be heads down because you are putting in a lot of time and effort to make that work. And it might be good to just be like, look, you go handle the business stuff for right now. I got the home stuff, and then we'll go from there. But gesundheit. But you know, the key with that I think all these couples, regardless of which way they did it, was that they had the conversation and figured out what worked best for them. And, you know, if I can leave you guys with a takeaway, it's take the lessons. Like I think Shane actually talked about this. He said, you know, don't try to copy what somebody else is doing, right? So don't try to copy us. Don't try to copy these other couples, but look at like the principles and what they're using. Like I think he talked about, don't watch the magician's trick and try to copy the trick. Watch their hands, right? Because if you see what the underlying principle is, you can then say, how do we apply that principle to our situation and what we're doing to make it work for us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the last couple with the roles, and I think it sort of goes along the lines there, is Tony and Suzanne, when we talked about the things that they had learned from their parents being entrepreneurial couples and how they kind of took what worked and what didn't work and were able to then create their working relationship out of that. So obviously they both grew up with entrepreneur parents that worked together, and they were show 71 if you want to go back and listen to that one. And when they started working in their business together, they weren't married yet. They actually just got married the weekend right before their episode release. Mm-hmm. So that was well timed.
I was going to say a random aside. These episodes all seem to come out like at the perfect time.
Yep.
So like
Tony and Suzanne's came out the Monday after they got married.
Yep.
Jason and Audrey's came out the day after they had their baby, their first child. There was a couple other ones too. And I was
just like,
happening
I was like, did you plan all of these? Like, are you psychic? Do you know things I don't know?
No, but I mean, Tony and Suzanne, they did a really nice job of walking into that working relationship ready to define those roles and kind of stick by them. And then they talked about like kind of having those check-ins where like, is this still good for you? Are you still okay are you still feeling okay in this role? Or do we need to shift and adjust things? And one of the things they talked about too was always checking in and saying, if this doesn't work, if the working relationship doesn't work, that's okay. We can go back and just be married or just be together. And it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that we failed. It doesn't mean, you know, all of this other stuff. It's just, hey, we tried something. It didn't work. We're going to go back to what does work.
Well, I think that's so important because as we're on these journeys, things are going to change, and things that worked before are no longer going to work, you know, maybe later on. And, you know, not looking at these things as failures, but as steps on the journey and being okay with making those changes. You know, obviously we're talking about it from kind of the roles you're playing and whatever, but I think that's even just a bigger theme to this whole thing is it's like, look, stuff's going to change, and, you know, what worked before, what got you here, you know, may not get you there. And you got to be open to kind of figuring out like what works for you.
Yeah. And that you tied that in so well to our very last lesson or theme from this series. And that is you have to find your way.
This is such a good point to highlight. And I think it's what so many people miss early on. And it's almost like when you see people hit their stride, it's almost always because they found their way.
Well, and I mean, it's funny because this one by far has the most episodes to reference to with this theme because we were like, ooh, and they said that too. And oh, and they did this too. So, I mean, it was just very apparent with all of the couples that we talked to, they're all very different. And even though a lot of these themes were pulled out from these episodes, everyone approached things differently. They all had a different way of doing it, a different reason they figured out that this way was the best way. And I think one of the people that really stood out was April and Aaron, show 65. You know, they talked about they both own their own businesses, multiple. They have 4 between the two of them. And they have 3 boys. And they talked about the difference in how they've built their businesses because they are a lifestyle business. You know, they built their businesses to be able to create a certain lifestyle for their family. And they raised their family a little bit differently too. Like they had a little bit of an unconventional way of raising their sons. And none of that would have been possible if they hadn't built the businesses they had and hadn't done it their way.
Well, I was going to say, and what was so cool with that was they each had their own businesses, and his business was actually like with more of the startup space and the venture capitalist space. And, we had some conversations about, so normally that's like long hours. So how do you talk about that being a lifestyle business and supporting what you guys want when traditionally it's not? And he's like, well, I made it what I wanted it to be.
Yep.
And, that was such an important lesson that, like, look, just because everyone else says it's got to be long hours and everything else, like, you design it your way and you make it work regardless of what other people tell you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and I mean, they spend like, I forget how many weeks it is. They spend a bunch of time traveling as a family. So like the way that they built their businesses, that is built in to, okay, well, we're going to take 3 months off and go travel around with the kids. And I mean, I think it's showing you don't have to follow like a specific model. You don't have to follow a specific set of steps that someone else says. You can literally design your business to fit around your lifestyle.
Yeah. Well, I can't think of another couple that displays that as much as Alex and Layla Hormozi. And their show was 80. And they actually got together first in the business. Mm-hmm. So they were first business partners, and they had a quote. I'll probably butcher it, but it was something like, we like loved each other, but we weren't in love. And they basically said that, what started with a business relationship turned into their romantic relationship mm-hmm. afterwards. And the quote he said was, love logically.
Yes.
And if people are listening to their episode, it's so against what most people say. But when you watch them, it's like, it makes so much sense, and it's working out so well for them. I mean, they're like, we love doing the same things. We're like the same person. And a lot of people say like opposites attract. They're like, no, we're the same person. We realize that we're building a gym and we love fitness and we love doing these things. So like they get up and they work out together and they do their business together. And it was just so cool to see how they really made it their way and mm-hmm. went against the grain of what everyone else says you should do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, that you may not agree with their way, but it's working. Like not everyone's relationship is going to look like yours. So it's really not a good idea to even compare yours to anyone else, especially in cases like this where it is a little bit unconventional. Like it's working for them. Mm-hmm. So who are we to say they did it the wrong way? Like they love each other, they're married, and they love their business, and their life is just one big ball of working out happiness.
Yeah. Well, and to that point, it's not so much about how you went about it. It's about, are you getting the results you're looking for? Like Tony Robbins had this simple formula for happiness at one point. And it was like, are your expectations or where you want to be matching where you're at? And if they are, that's happiness. Mm. If they're not, there's one of two things you can change. You can either change your expectations or change where you're at today. And it's like, regardless of which way you go, if that matches and you've got happiness, perfect.
And one of the people that fits in well for our next couple, because they
I do these transitions really well.
They talked a lot about happiness and what it meant to be happy. Tyler and Eric, they were show 73. And, they went through a lot of like big life changes at one point where they moved from, I think they were in North Carolina. They moved up to like Chicago or mm-hmm. something, kind of cross country a little bit.
They like changed their business.
One of them, like Tyler, quit his job to run his business. And then Eric quit his job. And just like through all of the struggles that they talked about going through, their theme kept being like, oh, but we were happy. Mm-hmm. We were at this point. We were happy. Then we made a change. And we found happiness. So it was like no matter what they were going through, they were still able to find the joys in their lives. Like even if we didn't have any money, they said, we would still find ways to enjoy each other's company and do things together.
I was going to say, that was the biggest thing I took from that episode. Like I kept trying to pry. I'm like, no, like tell me about this time where like you were angry. And they're just like, you know what? We knew what was important to us. And, I think it was them. Somebody has said, we had happiness when we had money, and we had happiness when we didn't have
I
money.
think it was that, yeah.
You know, and it's like, yeah, like build happiness into your life, and then the other stuff will kind of come and go. But just how, like when you listen to their episode, how much they're like, hey, we just knew that we were going to be able to get through whatever came because, you know, we loved each other and we had happiness.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, man, that's awesome.
Yeah. And they were a lot of fun too. I mean, just sharing how they did it, you know, like they talked about, taking the leap and just like quitting their jobs. And I was like, that would make me hyperventilate, you know, and like, but that was their way. They were okay with doing that. And they knew that about each other. So like they had each other's full support anytime they did anything big and crazy, you know? So I think it's really just important to know that about your relationship as well. Like, hey, we're up for the challenge. We're going to take this big risk and we're going to see what happens and be okay with it.
Well, and I forget which episode it was, but I remember at some point somebody said they just had to take the leap, and it was when their back was against the wall that they made things work. And I just remember being like, man, I can't imagine just taking that leap and like, you know, hoping that like the net appears or you build the plane on the way down. But what I appreciated about that was that everybody does it differently. And some people thrive when they've got comfort and security, so they know that they can kind of take the leap. And some people thrive when their back's against the wall, and that's when they do best.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of goes back to that point earlier in the previous episode of like, know yourself, because once you know yourself and where you're going to thrive, then you can find your way to make that happen.
Yeah. And I think Mike and Katie talked about that a little bit with going from the business that he had, like $1 million business, to all of a sudden that went under and they were back to square one, like making things work. And what I loved about Katie was, you know, she was 100% supportive of him that entire time. Now, obviously they were going through some tough times, but she believed in him so much that he was going to be able to make this entrepreneurship thing work, that they went through some tough times. Obviously their financial state changed because he lost the business, and then they didn't have, like, they talked about not having income for like stretches,
and not only once, multiple times.
But she talked about like going and getting a bartending job at night so that they had a really steady income and like medical benefits. And they talked about like one point where they didn't see each other until Sundays every week. So like they were working opposite schedules and they only saw each other one day a week. But for them, like they were both in it and knew that this was what they needed to do at that moment in time to be able to come out the other side and make things work.
Yeah. Well, and you know, sometimes just knowing that your partner supports you makes a huge difference. Like, I mean, I know there's been times where, you know, I was down or, you know, like feeling sorry for myself, and just having you there to be like, hey, look at everything you've done. Like, hey, this is just a setback. Makes a huge difference to kind of keep it going, especially when it's coming from your partner. Mike and Katie's episode was 74, by the way, if you guys want to check them out. I was going to say that their whole story of just like ups and downs, like literally the roller coaster of entrepreneurship that you hear about.
Yes. Yep.
But, you know, the other thing, so we had Vincent and Elizabeth on. They were show 76. They just kept talking about like, you know, ask how. Not can I do this, but how can I do this? And if you want to talk about like finding your way, if you just keep asking how, like you'll figure it out.
Yes.
But it's a lot of times people just say, well, and I mean, we hear this all the time, like, well, there's no way I can do what you guys do. Well, ask how. Ask how you could achieve what you want. And that will then, instead of kind of closing your mind down, it'll start opening up those possibilities.
Yeah. And I think, you know, that theme in their episode was just very apparent all the way across, because they actually worked for the same company together, but they were freelancers for this company. And when Elizabeth got pregnant, they were kind of like, oh, well, how are we going to do this? You know, like she didn't necessarily want to have to go into the office all the time. But Vincent was like on his way out from the job. So they were trying to figure out like, well, how is this going to work now? Because our medical benefits are through there and all this stuff. So they ended up asking the company to do a job share for them. So they actually both worked Elizabeth's job.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. Like I wouldn't even have known that was possible.
I was going to say, I never even heard of that before.
But they were like, how can we make this work? Asked, and it happened. So, I mean, just in like the same thing with, they started to have kids and, you know, they weren't in an area where they really liked the schools and what the kids were learning. So they decided to homeschool. And it was just like, well, how can we do this? How can we make sure our kids they also wanted to have freedom of like travel and things, which is really tough when your kids are in school to be pulling them in and out. But, well, how can we do this? Well, we're going to homeschool them. And I just remember being like, well, how did you transition into doing that? And they were like, we just did it. Well, we asked how.
And what was cool about that, like, because, you know, we've talked with a lot of people about homeschooling, like, you know, we don't homeschool, our kids go to school. And it was just very interesting because they're like, you know, a couple of years ago, we would have never thought homeschool would be in our path. But as we kept an open mind and asked how, that was what ended up working. And they're like, we're now on the other side where it's like, this is great. We can't imagine not doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, they were really funny. And I have to call out the Post-it note wall.
I love it.
It was hilarious. And I have to find a picture of that so I can post it. And last but not least, finding your way, a great way to round it out is with mentioning again, Shane and Jocelyn Sams from Show 69. Tom alluded to it a little bit already, talking about kind of how they look for concepts underneath things that they can apply to their own business. They have done that all along the way. They've always talked about, you know, well, we aren't going to do it that way. We're going to find our own way.
Well, I was going to say, and what's been funny with them is, you know, whenever, like they've even said it multiple times, whenever people told them that they had to do it one way, like it's almost a game with them now. They're like, all right, we're going to do it the opposite and just show you that we can make it work. So, you know, they openly talk about like, you know, they don't do these like big affiliate launches for their stuff. They don't do like JV
I don't think they do big launches.
Partnerships. Yeah, they got away from that. Like, and so basically whenever people tell them they can't do something, they're almost like challenge accepted.
Well, and I remember Shane talked about like going to one of the mastermind groups that he was in. And, you know, there was a bunch of other men there. I think it was a male mastermind.
Yep.
And they were all talking about like risk aversion and different things there. And then like different ideas in the business. And somebody told Shane like, well, you should be doing this. And he's like, well, I can't. And they were like, well, why not? And he's like, because my business partner is my wife. And they like,
and I got to check with her.
They couldn't comprehend that like he wasn't allowed to just make decisions in the business, that he had to go back and check with his wife. But he's like, this is the reason our business works is because of that aspect, because I never go off and do anything crazy. I'm always checking with her and we're making sure it's aligned with our values and it's aligned with our goals. Whereas all those other guys are just kind of out there making decisions willy-nilly and they don't have anybody keeping them accountable.
Well, and once again, I mean, to each their own. Like the key thing is it working for you? Right? Because there's going to be like one of the things we always do with people is we say, you know, let's design and model the business that'll work for you. And for some people, they're building empires. You know, they want to build the $100 million business and have a team of employees and make a huge impact. Awesome. For other people, they're trying to build just a lifestyle business that gives their family freedom. And maybe they only need a $500,000 business. So, you know, I think the whole thing, and I'm glad this was kind of that final point, was literally the reason our tagline says it, right? Your life, your business, your way. Figure out what you want, figure out the business that's going to make it work, and then figure out how you want to run it and pull it all together. And it may be different than other people have it, but at the end of the day, it's really comes down to you and what you want and how you want to do it.
Mm-hmm. All right. So my action for you today is going to be, I want to know which of these episodes resonated with you the most. So send us an email at hello@tomandariana.com and just let us know like, hey, so-and-so really resonated with me for this reason. I'd love to hear who resonated with you and also who else you would want to hear on this couple series.
Yeah.
So send me an email.
Yeah, that's a good one. What I want you guys to do is to go back to one of the episodes, whichever one resonated with you, and I want you guys to leave a comment with your takeaway. And the reason for this is because we all learn directly when we listen to something, but we can also learn from each other. So Ariana and I have just shared all of our takeaways and insights from this series. So you guys not only hear from the couples, but you hear kind of our analysis of things. I'd love to hear your analysis of things. Like, what is it that you took away? Because part of doing this is that, like we said, everyone kind of finds that couple that they resonate with. And now when other people find that same couple and they go to that show notes page and they see it, not only are they getting that couple, but now they're going to get your insights as well. So we all build and help each other with this.
Yeah. So you're going to find the comment section for whatever episode on the show notes page. So take the tomandariana.com and just pop the show number in after that, and that will take you to the correct page. And then for today's episode, you can find the show notes at tomandariana.com/83. And before we get to the books for today, we just want to remind you guys that we do have a special promotion running throughout the Couples Month series for our Lifestyle Builders mentorship program. So you can jump in and kind of come into the community and see what we're all about for 30 days for just a $1 trial. And Tom will tell you a little bit more about what Lifestyle Builders is.
Yeah, so really we created this program because a lot of people struggle with how do we make this all work, right? Like I was there 10 years ago. You know, I knew I wanted to build a better life for, Ariana and I and our future family. And I thought the way to do that was business, but I had no idea how to make it work. I had no idea how to get Ariana on board. And I did so many things the wrong way that what we wanted to do was to really help people in that situation to avoid some of the pitfalls that we had to go through. So this community is all about, really giving you guys direct access to us in the community for guidance, as well as training on how to build your business and how to make all of this work for you.
Mm-hmm. All right. What books you got for us today?
Okay. We got a couple good ones. So the first one is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Families. Now, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is one of my favorite books. It helps a lot with kind of figuring out who you are and how to be successful. This takes the same concepts and applies it to your family. Mm-hmm. So when I found it and read it through for the first time, I was like, this is great because they're basically giving me the cheat codes for how to make my family work. And we've applied a lot of these principles to help us really figure out not only what do we want as individuals, but what do we want as this family.
Yeah, and I know Tom has put in a lot of the concepts from this book into our book, the Lifestyle Builders book that is going to be coming out soon, so keep your ears peeled. But yeah, this was something that really changed the way that we sort of looked at our business and our family life as a whole unit.
Mm-hmm. I will let Ariana talk about the second book since it's one of the few books that she's actually read.
Yes, for better or for work. The reason I love this book is because you see it from the non-entrepreneur spouse's perspective. So it talks a lot about kind of how things worked for them and how they figured things out. And then going back and retrospectively looking at, what things did and didn't work for them and why. So I liked that book because it really let me see things from the non-entrepreneur spouse's perspective as they were looking at the entrepreneur spouse. So early on, this gave me a lot of insights into kind of what he's thinking, but it was shown to me by somebody who was kind of in my shoes.
Yeah, well, and what was cool about that book, especially if you guys have been listening to the series, is that they show different entrepreneurial couples in there.
Yep.
So it's not just their story, but then they show and highlight other entrepreneur couples in there as well. So it's kind of similar to this series where you see a lot of different perspectives.
And then the last one,
it's called Startup Life.
I don't know if they can see that very well.
And basically what this book is it's all about how to survive, being in an entrepreneurial family, all the ups and downs. And basically husband and wife wrote this, and he's the entrepreneur and she really wasn't. And they just talked through all the different, dynamics that come from this startup life that we're all in.
I just have to point out the very large unicorn sitting behind us that has been staring everyone down.
Video bombing us.
Unicorn video bomb.
If it's not our daughter video bombing us, it's our daughter's stuffed animals.
This unicorn. All right, you guys, it's been another amazing episode with Tom and Ariana, your hosts and lifestyle builders.
And as always, I want you guys to remember that it's your life, your business, your way. We'll see you next time.
Bye. Hey, we hope you enjoyed this episode. If you know another entrepreneur who may benefit from hearing this show, we would so appreciate you being a good friend and sharing it with them. And just a reminder, as a special offer during this super special Couples in Entrepreneurship month, we'd like to invite you to get started with your first month of Lifestyle Builders for only $1. Sign up now at tomandariana.com/LBcouples with the promo code LBcouples. Are you a Lifestyle Builders podcast fan? We'd love to hear from you. Head on over to tomandariana.com/iTunes and leave us a review.